there. My name is Dr. Crystal Steltenpole. I am at the Dartmouth Center for Program Design and Evaluation, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about positionality statements. We're actually going to spend the next 15 or so minutes doing a little bit of pre-work before we actually get into writing positionality statements, because there's a little bit of a shift of the way that we think about research whenever we're doing this work. I will turn off my video for the rest of this presentation because I think it could get a little bit distracting. As you can tell, I kind of move my hands around a lot. So I'm actually going to turn off the video for that. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to me via email or on Twitter. I've got my Twitter handle on here. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and please let me know if you need anything. Thanks. Before we get too far into things, I wanted to take a quick moment to acknowledge some folks that have been working on this with me over the last several years. So if you have a Twitter, it'd be great if you could follow them. They have awesome thoughts on a lot of different topics. Sakira Hudson, Kat Clement, and Jacqueline Siegel have all been instrumental in helping me to develop a lot of this work. So please give them a follow if you have a chance. So whenever we're taught about the scientific method, we tend to think that it goes something like this, right? We observe something, we go, oh, that's really interesting. Why does that happen the way that it does? We develop some kind of hypothesis about why we think it happens a certain way, or if we change this variable, this other variable is going to change in a specific and predictable way, right? We build an experiment, we test the hypothesis, we get some data, we analyze that data, right? We make a determination, were our results significant or non-significant, what was the effect size, all of that kind of fun stuff. And then we share our results. And this is a fairly straightforward process. I think we all probably know that it's never quite this easy. But there's also some really important things that are kind of missing from this, simplistic chart of the scientific method. And to kind of highlight that, I'm gonna show you an example, a tale of two researchers. So let's say that we have two researchers. We have researcher A and we have researcher B. And for the sake of illustration, let's assume that these researchers have similar backgrounds insofar as training goes. We could say that they're both social psychologists or something. They've trained at similar universities, similar experimental backgrounds, etc., etc., etc. They've been trained pretty standardly within their fields, similar backgrounds in terms of that training. So I'm going to use an example from within my own field of research, but I'm sure you'll be able to think of something similar in your field of research. So I study the way that people interact with and through technology. So I'm going to use as an example some research about video games. So let's look at researcher A. Researcher A thinks that video games are a waste of time. They have a son that struggles socially. They played a lot of video games growing up, and this researcher thinks that those two things might be related to one another. And really, overall, just from their own experiences, they're concerned about the effects the media has on kids. On the other hand, researcher B played video games themselves growing up. They used video games to connect with their own son while their son was growing up, and they tend to take a strengths-based approach to video game studies. I want to note up front, neither of these experiences is wrong. I'm just using it to exemplify a specific point about the route that their studies are going to take. So both of these researchers, they decide that they're not going to do an experiment per se, they're going to do a survey study because they want to hear from people who play games about their experiences. Researcher A designs a research study that looks at gaming addiction, that looks at violence in video games, and looks at social isolation in gaming. So asks gamers about questions about how they feel about their own addiction, about the effects of violence on video games on them, and then also like how socially isolated they feel. And then they also some general demographics, how often they play video games, their backgrounds, and all of that kind of fun stuff. Researcher B, on the other hand, asks about social connections through technology. So what connections are they making through social media, through video games, etc. Educational moments in video games, so maybe asking them to describe times that they felt that they've learned something and whether that information was accurate and when that's helped them, all of that kind of stuff. And then also maybe some questions about empathy in video games, like when when have you played a video game that has made you see somebody else's point of view, or learned about somebody with a different background than you? Those kinds of things. So these two researchers are both studying, similar things about the effects of video games and social media on people, but you can tell that they're taking two different tacks here. So what do they find, right? Researcher A finds that kids often struggle to monitor their gaming habits. They find that they start playing a game and then they look up and it's 3 hours later. They have trouble trouble putting games down. They have trouble, just engaging and getting other stuff done, right? That they need to get done. They would prefer to play video games. They also, this researcher finds links between video games and violence. They might find kids, when they're playing games, they feel more aggressive, or that they kind of get hyped up. And then they also find that gamers are more lonely than other peers. They say, yeah, I don't really hang out with friends in person that often. Most of the people that I talk to are online, those kinds of things. Researcher B, on the other hand, finds that kids learn from video games. They say, yeah, I've learned how to do some stuff around problem solving. I've learned how to look at things in different ways. Maybe they've learned some specific historical stuff, right? So they have these different things that they've learned. They also find, yeah, it's really helped me to see other people's perspectives, why somebody might take actions that I wouldn't have initially thought that they would want to take. I've learned more about maybe a social issue somewhere else in a different part of the world, or maybe even here at home, wherever home is for them. And then also saying, yeah, I talk to a lot of different people online. I use social media to connect with other people who like to play this game. I've made friends. Maybe some of those friends have become in-person friends, right? So they found a lot of increased social connections through this. Okay, so both researchers report their results. They go to conferences, right? Maybe they talk to the media. How does the media interpret their findings? For this study, the researcher says, well, video games, they increase aggression, they increase social isolation. Kids are addicted to video games, right? So video games are terrible for you. Maybe the researcher doesn't say that. The media would certainly pick that up that way, right? This researcher finds that video games are terrible for you. Here's why. Don't play them, or don't let your kids play them. On the other hand, looking at researcher B's conclusions, we see that video games will save the world, right? They can teach you empathy. They can be ways to teach people educational stuff. They can actually help you connect with people, and this could be really important for people who don't have a lot of in-person connections, right? So you have these two researchers who started saying, I want to look at the effects of video games or media on kids, and they came to two very different conclusions. So what happened? They both made observations and developed a hypothesis and tested that hypothesis, analyzed their data, shared their results, but they came to two completely separate conclusions. Well, in part, what happened is that their observations differed, right? And their observations differed because they had different experiences in the world. And so this is a fairly simplistic example, but there are a lot of ways, even within fairly specific fields, that our experiences, our observations, our perspectives, our biases can play a role in the research process. So how do we prevent this? Well, realistically, we can't, right? People are people. People have baggage. They bring that baggage with them to whatever they do. Science is ultimately a human endeavor, and you can't remove the humanity from people. What we can do is to make those implicit assumptions more explicit through a process known in qualitative research as reflexivity. So that's an umbrella term for the process of becoming aware of and critically analyzing your own beliefs, perspectives, and potential biases within the research process. And there's a specific practice that qualitative researchers do to help to make these sorts of reflective practices more explicit, and that's called a positionality statement. Which is a description of the researcher's worldviews and positions, specifically as they relate to a research project. So it's not like a biography. You're not just listing out your entire life story. You're not listing some random smattering of facts about yourself. They're specifically in, things about the researcher slash the research team that could influence the way that this project was designed and interpreted, the data interpreted. Um, and this can be really helpful to make that more explicit, so we can kind of see when we do have results that contradict each other, what are some things that might be different between those two projects that they come to such different conclusions. So ideally, you engage in reflexivity throughout the research process. You can see here is a table with some questions that you might ask yourself at different stages of research. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. That would be super annoying and take a long time. But this is Michelle Jameson, Madeline Pownall, and Gisela Govart wrote this great paper that's currently on SciArchive. I expect that it will be published soon somewhere. But it's kind of helps people go through that reflexivity process throughout the research, all the different stages of research. So I recommend taking a look at it. But here are some questions that you might ask yourself, right, as you're trying to start this process of thinking about how you might influence the research process, and vice versa, how that process might influence you. So Jacqueline Siegel showed me this activity, and I find it really helpful when working with folks who are thinking about maybe creating a positionality statement, or if they want to try to start engaging in reflexivity, but they're really not entirely sure. So this is an activity by Jacobson and Mustafa that's a social identity map, and so it's basically where you start to list out some facets of your identity that are important to you. They don't have to be the ones that are listed here. So for instance, one of the ones, if I were making a social identity map and I was thinking about my research area, I would put my experience with gaming communities as a part. I don't necessarily identify as a gamer. I don't really like that term because it's very vague and unclear. But I might put that in a box just for simplicity's sake, and kind of move on with that. But so you pick some topics or pick some facets. They may not align with the ones that are here, but just aspects of your social identity that are important to you. And so that's in the purple boxes, and then in the gray boxes, that next level, you talk about how these facets impact your life. And that could be for better or worse. It could be neutral, just different ways that that aspect of your identity impacts your life. And then you see these green lines. So the next thing that you do is you identify emotions or consequences that are tied to these impacts. So if you're really wanting to see one of these in action, the paper actually has one that's filled out. I think it might actually have two, one for each author, and you can kind of compare and contrast and see what that means. And then after you're done, filling this out, and you could fill it out, as many of these boxes as you want to, really. You can ask yourself some questions like, how do these facets of my identity, maybe in combination with other facets even, impact the way that I approach, interact with, and interpret my research? And then you might also ask yourself, how do these facets impact the way I understand and interact with my participants? So if you're, potentially trained quantitatively and experimentally, you don't necessarily interact with your patients, right? They show up to the lab, or maybe they don't even show up to a lab. Maybe they just do all of their experiments online, right? But they show up to a lab, you give them some instructions. You don't really get to know them. There's not an extended period of time. You probably don't follow up with them, right? Whereas if you're trained qualitatively, maybe you actually have to engage in building a relationship with a participant in order to help them feel comfortable with you asking them a bunch of really intimate questions about their lives. So, even small things like how you were trained, perhaps that's a big thing, but other things might impact the way that you approach your work, experiences that you've had, aspects of your identity. And so this is a really, really helpful tool for getting people to get started with all of this. And I highly recommend that folks take a few minutes. You don't have to share it with anybody. This can just be for you. But it can also be really kind of fun to do as a group activity. I've done this with a couple of different labs, and they've found it to be a really engaging process. So once you have this information, once you've done the social identity mapping exercise, you might be wondering, well, what do I do with this? You can just sit and grapple with it for a while if you want. It can be hard to do this, um, and sometimes you might want to sit with it, especially if it's your first time doing these kinds of activities. Um, but you can also pull it together if you want into a positionality statement with some additional, workshopping, which we'll get into future videos. Um, and you can include it into your research. It's not, like I mentioned, it's not just a listing of characteristics of you. It's how those characteristics interact with the specific research project. So you're not necessarily expecting to take the same positionality statement and apply it to a bunch of different papers. You might if it's all still kind of relevant, but it's also a good idea to kind of go through and reflect and see, like, okay, are there aspects of this project that are different from the last project that I wouldn't necessarily have the same exact positionality statement. So it is important to update it and to reflect on it and to edit it as needed. It's not meant to be a static document that you just kind of throw into a manuscript. But it is hard to do this work, so it's okay if you're finding yourself going, wow, this is really difficult. I'm not sure what I'm doing. That's an entirely natural reaction, especially if you're just starting out with this. So in the next videos, we're going to talk about how do we actually write one of these things? How do we actually put together something coherent that talks about our role in the research process? We'll get to that in the next video. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, please do feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.